Inez Fernandez is another indigenous Maypa woman living in rural Guerrero who was raped on March the 22nd, 2002 in her home at gunpoint when 11 soldiers entered her home. She reported the crime and it was transferred to military jurisdiction. A biological sample that was taken was tested using obsolete methods that destroyed the sample, which now will preclude DNA identification of the offender. Both of these women petitioned the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights based on the lack of impartiality and independence of the military justice system, including the complete failure to investigate both of these crimes. To give you an example of the type of investigation methods the military employed in these cases, in one case, a court reporter and an entire military platoon came to the victim's home. She was called outside and pointed to the dozens, and the dozens of military personnel were pointed out to her. They were standing there armed, and she was asked to pinpoint the perpetrators. She was obviously too intimidated to do so and returned into her home in tears. So the military investigators, when they closed the investigation, cited in part her failure to comply with the investigation. The Inter-American Commission found that the military justice system is inadequate and in violation of Mexico's human rights obligations. So the women, therefore, were not required to exhaust all domestic remedies, as is generally required, in order to bring a case before the Commission. This is something that Robert Morales is probably discussing right now in his presentation as well. Unfortunately, we won't hear it. So the Commission found a violation in that case, and they referred both of the cases to the Inter-American Court, which recently issued its judgment and affirmed the Commission's findings. Victims of abuses at the hands of the military are often excluded from proceedings. The delegation met with the Minister of the Interior, and he acknowledged the need for reform but defended the use of this system. Mexico has entered a reservation to Article 9 of the Convention on the Forced Disappearance of Persons. This article states that persons accused of forced disappearance may not be tried under military jurisdiction, and that acts of forced disappearance shall not be considered to have been committed in the course of military duties. And Mexico has also refused to recognize the competence of the UN committee that oversees what will oversee the implementation of this treaty once it's in force. Additionally, the Inter-American Court in 2009, in December, released a decision regarding the forced disappearance of Rosendo Radia during the Dirty War in Guerrero in the 1970s. In that case, the court found that military jurisdiction was a violation of access to justice obligations, and investigations of crimes to be committed against civilians by members of the armed forces should not be conducted by military courts. They also found, rather interestingly, that Mexico's reservation to the Convention on Forced Disappearance is invalid, and required immediately that Mexico adopt, within a reasonable time frame, legislative reforms to harmonize the Code of Military Justice with international standards. The military justice system isn't independent of the military's general structure. There's no separation of powers between the executive and the judicial branches. All of the members of the military system working in the justice system are answerable to the military attorney general, and none of them have security of tenure, including the judges. The attorney general can order at any time that an investigation be closed and can issue pardons, and judges can be removed from their postings with ease. There's also a complete lack of transparency to the investigations. Often the only information that's made public is the decision, which is in 99% of cases not guilty. Another major focus of the delegation's investigation was lawyers and human rights defenders. I wanted to bring to your attention Article 1 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which says that everyone has the right to promote and strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at national and international levels. Human rights lawyers and defenders in Mexico face regular harassment. Despite this, they manage to advocate effectively and with passion for vulnerable sections of Mexican society. This includes historically marginalized groups such as the poor, indigenous people, and groups deemed potentially subversive by the government. The most common threat that these defenders receive is threats to their lives and their physical integrity. Well, the declaration that I quoted here isn't binding legally. It restates existing law that's contained in other international legal instruments. So it does represent, I think, an authoritative statement on international law. The Mexican government has undertaken some recent legal and political reforms to address the situation with respect to human rights defenders, but generally, while the federal government has undertaken some positive reforms, this is not being translated to the situation on the ground at local levels. I'm now going to talk to you about 3 of the groups who we met with when we went to Mexico. We interviewed members of the Organization for the Future of the Mepa People, OPIM, which is a group of indigenous people located in Guerrero, and their sister organization, the Organization for the Future of the Mixteco People, and their lawyers, Tlachinolan Human Rights Center. For all 3 of these organizations, a pattern of persistent repression has effectively shut down their work. Tlachinolan was forced to close their offices in Ayutla, Guerrero in 2009 as a result of fears for their safety. OPIM and OPFM worked together to fight for the rights of Mepa and Nefsavi, or Mixteco indigenous peoples. They fight against discrimination, poverty, and the exclusion of indigenous peoples generally from the social fabric of Guerrero. They raise awareness about their needs, and they criticize crimes that are committed against them, such as forced sterilizations and sexual offenses, including the assaults of Inez and Valentina, who I mentioned to you previously. So as a result of this work, several members of the organizations have been persecuted, and this has included false criminal accusations, threats, attacks, theft, torture, sexual assault, forced disappearance, and murder. Lorenzo Fernandez Ortega was a member of OPIM, and he was also the brother of Inez Fernandez, who was sexually assaulted by the military. He was kidnapped in February of 2008. His body was found several days later, bearing signs of torture. His murder took place shortly after his sister testified before the Inter-American Commission in respect of her case. And it took place shortly before he was scheduled to meet with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Luis Arbor, to present cases of human rights abuses. There have been no charges in the murder. Raul Lucas Lucia and Manuel Ponce Rosas were respectively the president and secretary of the OPFM. They were victims of a forced disappearance in February of 2009. They were kidnapped at a public ceremony in Ayutla, in Guerrero, where municipal authorities were present, by 3 armed men who identified themselves as police officers and forced the 2 men into an unmarked car. Raul's wife was immediately called from her husband's cell phone and they threatened to kill her husband if she did not remain quiet. And they stated that this was happening to them because, quote, "you are defending Indians," unquote. She complained to authorities and no investigation was opened and no steps were taken to locate the men. Their bodies were found several days later, also bearing signs of torture, with their hands tied behind their backs. The investigation in this case has been inadequate, and there have been no investigation on the failure of the state to investigate or search for the men before their bodies were found. However, due to local and international pressure, the case was recently transferred from state jurisdiction to federal jurisdiction. But when we met with federal officials last December, they weren't able to give us an update on the status of this investigation, and the persons responsible remain at large.